Hello, and welcome to the Biocommunications Association, BCA, our third presentation in our Spotlight series. My name is James Kepler. I am the Secretary Treasurer of the BCA and your host for today's presentation. So today I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Robin Williams. Robin is a distinguished photographer with 50 years of professional experience as a practitioner, researcher, and teacher. He holds undergraduate qualifications in both scientific and medical photography and master's and PhD degrees in medicine. He is an accredited senior imaging scientist and a fellow of 7 learned societies, including the BCA. For 20 years, Robin had a stellar career as a medical photographer, starting at Cambridge Medical School and culminating as Director of Medical Illustration and Teaching Services at Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School in London. Robin then moved into academia and was a professor of photography for over 25 years and Dean of the Faculty of Art, Design, and Communication at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, of course. Robin was also a founding governor and chair of the academic board at Australia's top private photography college. He has published over 70 scientific papers and books and delivered over 400 presentations at national and international conferences. His contributions to medical imaging have been recognized by numerous professional societies. He's well known to the BCA. In addition to being a fellow, he is also a recipient of the Louis Schmidt Laureate, which is our highest honor bestowed by the Biocommunications Association. In recent years, Robin has concentrated on his personal work and has quickly established himself as a recognized landscape and nature photographer. He has received many international awards for his work in this genre. Today, Robin will present Flights of Beauty, Flights of Sorrow. Okay, Robin, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. All right, so we'll get started. Thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. And good morning for those in the Southern Hemisphere. Good evening for those in the Northern. Or indeed, if you tune in later for a recording, whatever time of the day it is, thank you for tuning in to listen to a little short story about a project of mine called Flights of Beauty, Flights of Sorrow. It's really about climate change and biodiversity, but thinly disguised as scanning macro photography of bird feathers. First, a bit about birds and their feathers, for those of you who aren't necessarily ornithologically minded. Birds are all around us, present on every continent, in every environment. We see them every day. Maybe they even wake you up in the morning. We almost take them for granted, but they are truly amazing animals. You know, there are 10,000 species of birds on the planet, ranging in size from the huge albatross to the tiny little hummingbird. Birds are supremely adapted to flying. For example, they have hollow bones. They lay eggs rather than carrying a baby inside their bodies. No checked-in baggage here. And they always go to the toilet before taking off to reduce their weight. Some fly enormous distances to breed, like the Arctic tern, with a round trip of 32,000 kilometres every year. That's a lot of frequent flyer points. Most sing, and some, like the lyrebird, can accurately mimic other birds, human speech, or even a camera shutter. Just have a listen. Penguins, of course, are birds. They fly underwater. And kiwis can't fly at all. The birds, that is, not New Zealanders. Birds are close relatives to the dinosaurs. In fact, chickens are genetically close relatives of Tyrannosaurus rex. So, Next time you order your Kentucky Fried Chicken, just remember you're eating a dinosaur's cousin. Some birds have amazing eyesight. The eagle can spot a rabbit from 4 kilometers away, whereas the barn owl has such good hearing that it can detect a mouse moving underneath the ground whilst it flies overhead. Some are plain, usually the girls, whilst some wear outrageous colours, usually the boys. Actually, the females are camouflaged brown so that they can't be seen when they're on the nest. Can you spot a nightjar on her nest in the right-hand photo? Pretty tricky, eh? But it's the feathers that are the most distinctive feature of a bird's anatomy and some of the most beautiful objects in nature. Feathers are fundamental to many aspects of a bird's existence. They provide insulation for controlling body temperature, aerodynamic power necessary for flight, colours used for communication and camouflage, and, they are incredibly beautiful objects. The human fascination with feathers goes back to ancient civilizations where rare and beautiful feathers were used in headdresses as a symbol of power and wealth. In fact, to this day, we still use the phrase, "Oh, that'll be quite a feather in his cap," as recognition of great achievement. And let's remember that every document written from the Book of Kells and the Bible through to the works of Shakespeare and Dickens was done with a feather. The fascination with feathers has always been part of fashion, so much so that some birds were rendered almost extinct by the avaricious consumption of the fashion industry. In Australia, egrets, herons, lyrebirds, and emus were amongst the species targeted by plume hunters. In just one season, 1911, over 400 lyrebirds were killed in Victoria, and along the Murray River, nearly 1/3 of all of the egret and heron were slaughtered. Feathers were worth their weight in gold in the 19th century, with demand outstripping supply. Specialist historians have estimated that over 300 million birds were slaughtered at their nests to supply the fashion industry. And it wasn't just feathers. Amazingly, whole birds found their way onto the hats of the rich and famous. So there we are. That's what you can do with your dead budgerigar. Pop it on your hat. And just in case you thought all of that was in the past, these are two very recent examples. In fact, as the use of fur has decreased, the use of feathers has actually increased again. But the most important thing about these ubiquitous and beautiful animals is that they are outstanding indicators of the health of the environment. So much so that miners always carried a canary in a cage with them down the mines. If there was a problem with the air, the canary would die first, giving the miners warning of the impending disaster. Now, I'm sure that everyone listening knows what a catastrophe climate change is. Ask the people of Florida or Valencia or Bangladesh, choose the spot. All these people losing homes and livelihoods to hurricanes and floods, or to the people of Canada and California who have lost their homes and farms in the bushfires. But the impact of climate change is not just fires, floods, and storms. It's also significantly reducing biodiversity through species loss. The IPCC reports that 30% of species could die out if global mean temperatures were to go up by just 2 degrees. It's horrifying then to learn that the global average surface temperature has risen by over 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution, with the most dramatic rises being since 1975. The data from 5 independent research teams all show the same trend: rapid warming in the past few decades, with the last decade as the warmest. Climate change doesn't necessarily mean that temperatures rise everywhere at the same time and the same rate, but overall, it's rising significantly. The recently published report by the World Wildlife Fund shows that nature is disappearing at an alarming rate. Over the last 50 years, wildlife populations have shrunk by an average of 73%. That's an average. Just look at Latin America, a 95% decline. In the natural world, a number of tipping points are highly likely if the current trends continue, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the planet. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species lists 164 birds as extinct, 225 birds as critically endangered, possibly extinct, and nearly 1,300 as endangered or vulnerable. 13% of the world's bird species are now considered threatened. A shameful total of 9 species of Australian birds, including this stunning paradise parrot, are known to have become extinct since European settlement, and many of Australia's birds are currently threatened by a whole variety of different sources. In fact, Australia probably holds the gold medal for the worst mammal extinction rate. Around the world, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of recovery programs designed to rescue endangered species from the brink of extinction. Here in Victoria, Australia, for example, we have breed and release programs for the orange-bellied parrot, the ground parrot, and the helmeted honeyeater. Now, important though these programs are, the problem really, as I see it, is that we're often releasing these birds back into exactly the same environmental conditions that caused the threat to their survival in the first place. And so it was that Flights of Beauty, Flights of Sorrow was born. It's a kind of science-art crossover project. In a technical sense, obtaining such detailed and clear photographs of the feathers is very challenging and draws on my skills as a biomedical photographer. But in a creative way, the project aims to engage the viewer in the beauty of bird plumage and at the same time highlight the disastrous loss of species. Einstein, the great scientist, once said that pure science is pure art. And it's something that's always driven me, my sort of yin and yang, if you like. Amidst the pure science of my work, I've always sought out and celebrated beauty, images that were both tools of scientific investigation and also an expression of pure natural beauty. Some of you may be old enough to remember my Rochester presentation called Standardization or Imagination, where I encouraged everyone to make images with both sides of their brain. I've always suggested that medical photographers take the scientific, factual image first, but then think outside the box for an additional photograph that might be more emotional or creative. that perhaps would tell the story better. I began to realise that this type of photograph might be a novel way of telling the story of species loss and declining biodiversity. After all, how many more photographs of polar bears stranded on ice floes do we need to see as icons of climate change? I wanted the images to have a high level of impact, aesthetically pleasing, ultra sharp, and very large. In Flights of Beauty, images of feathers of a diverse range of common species are presented in a way that demonstrates their extraordinary beauty. Whilst in Flights of Sorrow, we see the feathers of extinct and endangered species as a telling message about the importance of species loss. Initially, when I started the project, I picked up naturally ejected feathers or roadkill and window strikes and photographed them. I soon learnt that these feathers were usually in a terrible condition when magnified. Also, it was very difficult to capture the intricate detail at high magnification and high definition because of the very limited depth of field. I also learnt that in many countries, including the US and Australia, and indeed in the UK, it's illegal to have in one's possession feathers from threatened species. So I had to get legitimate access to feathers from birds that were threatened, endangered, or indeed extinct. The natural place to start was the museums sector. In this case, the Natural History Museum in Britain, whose Rothschild collection at Tring in Hertfordshire has over 750,000 specimens covering 95% of the world's species. It's the largest collection of bird skins anywhere in the world. But I hadn't reckoned on this man standing in my way. Edwin Rist, a professional flautist. How come, I hear you ask? Well, he was also a champion fishing fly tyer who used extremely rare bird feathers to tie his prize-winning trout and salmon fishing ties. In 2009, he posed as a scientific photographer wanting to access Tring's rare bird skins. The access he was granted enabled him to plan a most daring nighttime robbery of hundreds of bird skins worth millions of dollars on the black market, most of which were never recovered. The full story can be found in this excellent book, but needless to say, it didn't make my life very easy. Museums around the world tightened their security protocols and became very suspicious of scientific photographers, especially the museum at Tring. Back in Melbourne, where of course I was well known as an upright citizen, I was fortunate to get support for the project from Parks Victoria, Zoos Victoria, and our world-class museum in Victoria. And I'm indebted to them for their help in providing authorised access to bird feathers, skins and wings for this project. Although at this point, I did have to narrow the scope of the project to Australian birds. The Melbourne Museum has an incredible collection of over 70,000 specimens, representing 4,000 species, including the historic collection of John Gould, a 19th century contemporary of Charles Darwin and James Audubon. I was allowed to set up a working macro studio within the museum and given open access to their incredible collection. You can probably see here that I used my old Nikon D800 set to manual with the even older 105 micro Nikkor lens. in combination with either the PN11 extension ring or the PB4 bellows. Lighting was either a small softbox or a double-armed fibre optic lamp, and more of that later. The camera was tethered to my laptop so that so I could review the images as they were being taken. And then the images were offloaded and stored straight away onto 2 portable SSD drives to ensure image security. The whole variety of magnifiers that you see around the place there were really compensating for my failing close-up eyesight. So the birds are all stored as skins in trays within cabinets under very strictly controlled environmental conditions. There's even positive airflow, just like modern operating theatres, to ensure that contaminants and pathogens do not enter the workspace. Many of the older specimens were preserved using highly noxious gases, so I had to adhere to some very strict health and safety protocols for them, including protective clothing, gloves and glasses. Basically full PPE. It actually felt just like being back at the hospital. The specimen handling had to be meticulous. The birds were carefully removed from the storage cabinets and placed into special white plastic trays for carrying to my little studio area. Specimens varied in size from a massive albatross at over 2 meters to tiny finches that would easily fit in the palm of my hand. I photographed the birds on black plexiglass to give a neutral background that would also allow for cleaning with special chemicals between the specimens in order to avoid any genetic cross-contamination. You see, most of the access to this collection is actually by scientists who are taking DNA samples for taxonomic research. With the smaller birds, the museum tags, which document the bird's identification and classification, its history and so on, were significantly larger than the bird itself. But of course, they could not be removed. The specimens were also incredibly delicate and rare. This Capricorn yellow chat was collected in 1859, and it was the only specimen of this bird in the 70,000 strong collection. It was the global DNA standard for the species and listed as critically endangered, thought extinct. A unique specimen to be treated very carefully. Thankfully, all my training as a medical photographer and all those thousands of specimens that I photographed in the past really came in very useful. I must say, I was rather horrified to find that many of the tags recorded the bird as having been shot at nest. Apparently, a common collecting procedure in the 19th century, you shot the parents and also collected the eggs. Probably the worst part of the project was using the museum's database, which has 70,000 specimens of birds alone and a really unfriendly user interface. My complete lack of knowledge of ornithological taxonomy and the proper Latin names for species meant using the database to find the location of a bird within the collection was a real challenge. There's also some disagreement between the various bird authorities on the status of threatened species. So I constructed my own little spreadsheet drawn from all of these sources and annotated it with the information from the museum's database about where I could find the specimen within the collection. One problem that I hadn't expected, given the very high standards of the conservators, was that at such high magnification, dust, mites, cotton wool, and other artifacts became really obvious and distracting in the photographs. So I had to meticulously prepare each specimen by gently brushing the feathers with a soft sable brush. Now, birds come in every colour of the rainbow, quite literally, and getting faithful colour rendition proved a little more tricky than I had imagined. The colours in the feathers of a bird are formed primarily in two different ways, either from pigments or from light refraction caused by the structure of the feather. The coloration created by pigments is independent of the structure of the feather. Pigment colorization in birds comes from three different groups of pigments: carotenoids in yellows and oranges, melanins in browns and blacks, and porphyrins, pinks and reds. And if they seem familiar, of course, they are. These are the groups of pigments that we find commonly in nature and are responsible for that change from greens through to orange and browns during the fall. Tiny air pockets in the barbs of the feathers can scatter incoming light, resulting in a very specific colour. Blue colours in feathers are almost always produced in this way. Blue wavelengths are refracted by the keratin air matrix and other colours absorbed by a layer of melanin. The greens of Australian parrots are actually the result of yellow pigments overlying the blue reflecting characteristic of their feathers. Now, it's not generally understood that quite a lot of bird coloration is caused by iridescence. The iridescent colours are the result of the refraction of incident light caused by the microscopic structure of the feather barbules. The refraction works just like a prism, splitting the light into a rich component range of colours. As the lighting angle changes or varies, the refracted light becomes visible in an ever-changing iridescent display. So I found in practice that overall softbox lighting needed to be supplemented with some direct light from a fibre optic lamp in order to pick up any iridescence. And also, every stack sequence had to be preceded by an image with a colour calibration chart at the start. Now, feathers are not at all flat. They're highly curved. That's how they create lift, just like an aircraft wing. So recording the feathers at a primary magnification of 1:1 or greater meant that it was impossible to get any more than a tiny section of the feather sharp. Even using an aperture of f32, which in itself would be very undesirable because of the inevitable diffraction, you just don't get anywhere near enough depth of field. I'm hoping that you can see that on this pair of photographs via the Zoom link. The yellow arrows are just showing you their different points of focus around the curvature of the feather. So I had to use the scanning macro photography technique, where a macro lens is used to take many photographs through the depth of the subject. I'm sure that you're all familiar with it. I would start with the closest part in sharp focus and take a photograph. Then move the whole camera and lens forward by a tiny amount and take another photograph. And then another and another until the furthest part was in sharp focus. In some cases, I had to take up to 200 separate photographs. Now, of course, moving the camera and the lens assembly forward by tiny amounts is very tricky. You can use a purpose-built system like this Cognisys stack shot, which comprises a macro rail driven electronically via a very precise stepping motor, all connected back to your computer for full automation. Now, I do own this system, but I've always had problems getting it to talk reliably to my Mac computer, requiring the use of the terminal program to modify the serial bus kernel and installing modified drivers into the Mac, which I really don't like doing. So for this project, I opted to actually do it all mechanically using the beautifully engineered NISI macro rail. Now this rail is so smooth and precise with no play or overrun. And it also has a graduated micrometer screw that makes it possible to do step widths of 10 microns. The resulting stack of images are then processed in the computer to combine them into a single image comprising the very sharpest parts of each of the constituent images. The result is an astonishingly sharp image of the entire feather. Now, there are three mainstream software solutions for the image processing. You can use Photoshop, or the two main commercial products, Zarine Stacker and Helicon Focus. They all work in basically the same way. They create layers for each of the original kind of slice images. And in this case, you can see them. There are 68 images that you can see the tiny little icons all stacked up down the right-hand side of the program. And then an algorithm identifies the sharpest parts of each layer image, and then soft edge layer masks are created so that only the sharpest parts are visible. The layers with their masks are then merged into one fully sharp image. Often you then have to go back and fix up any artifacts or ghosts from the lighting, and you have to do that manually. Now, this kind of image processing really is a true benefit of digital imaging. But be aware that it takes a serious amount of computing power. You know, if you have over 100 full resolution images in your image stack, your computer runs red hot for hours. Now, Photoshop is great where you only have a few images to merge. So, for example, I use Photoshop for focus stacking for landscapes, where typically you might only have 5 pictures to stack together. But Zarine Stacker and Helicon Focus are both made for scanning macro photography, and they both work extremely well. They both have options on the algorithms for the stacking. They have tools for editing the stack and a direct interface to the stack shot if you wanted to use it. Now, Zarine's tool set is more extensive, but it only works on JPEGs and it runs fairly slowly. Helicon will work with DNG and TIFF files and is much faster, and so this made Helicon the software of choice for this particular project. So, over a prolonged period, I took over 5,000 images of over 150 species. And I'll just show some of them to you now, but the complete collection can be found on our website if you'd like to have a look later. So this first image is of the Lord Howe woodhen, now endangered, the mulga parrot on the left, and the Norfolk Island thrush on the right, which is now extinct. The short-billed black cockatoo, listed as endangered. The crimson rosella, thankfully, not only beautiful, but plentiful still. The marbled frogmouth on the left, stunning, amazing. It's like a kitchen top. And the ground parrot on the right, vulnerable. Love the heart shapes on the feathers. This is the paradise parrot, totally extinct. This was a 100-year-old specimen. The Macquarie Island rail, now extinct. The Regent honeyeater on the left, which is endangered. And unfortunately, the malleefowl, which on the right, which used to be fairly common, is now listed as vulnerable. I love the image of what looks like a whole host of flying bats. So it's like feathers on feathers. It's absolutely amazing. On the left, the crimson rosella, and on the right, the red-tailed black cockatoo. Beautiful, and thankfully not yet endangered. The Gordian finch from the northern parts of Australia, now endangered, and the hooded plover from the southern states of Australia, endangered. The superb parrot, now critically vulnerable. The juvenile crimson rosella, weird, isn't it? A bird that's called crimson has got blue and green feathers, but that's only in the juvenile version. It does turn crimson in adulthood. The absolutely beautiful wing of the Australian darter. Remember we said penguins were birds? Well, here are the bird feathers of a southern rockhopper penguin. The sacred kingfisher. The wing of the malleefowl. And lastly, the Australian masked owl. I always think this one looks rather like snowshoes on wind-blown snow. Now, they've been exhibited in public galleries here in Australia, and I've really enjoyed giving floor talks at exhibitions, especially for kids who realise, that this is their future world that we're talking about. Gigi, my wife, very kindly put together a short-run photo book all about the project, and some of the work has been very successfully turned into fine art, which I've been selling. At one point, I did have a lot of fun in my home studio, practicing the techniques and working on an alternative body of work called Flights of Fantasy. You can see the purple of Prince and the gold of Cleopatra. Marilyn Monroe's skirt being blown up over the grey grid, and the Dalai Lama. Too many late nights and too much gin, I think. On one occasion, during the photography at the museum, I looked at the tags and realised that the specimen had been collected by Charles Darwin. How incredibly privileged to have been able to access such rare and beautiful objects. And how very sad to know that so many have gone forever because of the reckless way that we have treated the planet. I'll leave you with one thought. Climate change and habitat loss really matter. Resuscitating the canary is not enough. We need to close the mine. Thank you so much for tuning in. And now, before you all fall asleep, I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
That was an absolutely beautiful and moving presentation, and that we have a very active chat session, which I would like to go ahead and just read them off to you. Some are questions.
That would be great.
Okay. Daniel Edwards, absolutely stunning images, Robin, an amazing project, and so awareness raising. I'm going to kill this person's name. Hakan Carvenstrom. That's not right. But anyway, fantastic work, really amazing project and photography. Amanda Rebecki, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Is the book still available?
No, it was just a short run publication, and all of those are now gone. But we could, if there was demand, we could look at another run. But right now, no, we don't have any copies.
Okay, I have another question here from Peter Kensington. What do you think about the destruction of emu wren habitat for the rocket range in SA? I imagine that's South Australia.
Yeah. Look, it's tragic, and it's just one instance of many thousand instances where we have elected to use land in certain ways, and it's caused massive destruction to the animal world. And I think so it's sad, but the value of that of the question, I think, Jim, is that it points to the fact that it's not just climate change that's affecting both the future of birds, but also all species. So it's a range of things. It's farming practices, it's climate change, it's the way we keep domestic animals, it's what we do with our hedgerows. It's it's a vast range of factors. But I've taken the view that if we don't master and deal with climate change, then the rest, in a sense, becomes irrelevant. Farming practices and so on. I think the point of the question is right, though, that we do need to keep holding the feet of government to the fire, around a whole range of issues, not just climate change, but land use and so on. So, yeah, good, fair point.
Excellent. Okay, Maya Diviak, incredible presentation. I think we have a theme here. Everyone pretty impressed. Beautiful, beautiful. I'll finish here. Beautiful, moving, and infuriating in equal measure. Thank you. Bob Turner has a question. Did you have a formula for how many images you would capture per millimeter of depth of field?
Oh, not really is the answer. Because the specimens varied so much, if you were looking at just a flat part of a wing, there was, rather less of a problem than if you're looking at, for example, the curvature of the breast of a bird, where there's a massive difference in depth and therefore depth of field. So no, there was no standard formula. I was sort of looking at, roughly speaking, 10 frames, on one rotation of the micrometer. So that's 10 microns at a time. But that did vary. So as I think I mentioned, on the big curved surfaces, it was perhaps up to 200 images. And that, it's a very significant depth for that magnification. But no, it's a bit of practice and suck it and see. So no, I can't give you a formula, I'm afraid.
Okay, Tom Hirchin says, how does one do a standing O on Zoom? I would mean that probably means ovation, a standing ovation. Yeah, says
That's
very
great.
impressive. Yeah, very impressive, outstanding. Thank you. Marie Jones, wonderful images. Thank you. Really inspiring, thought-provoking for how the specimens are collected. David Rosen, incredible images and presentation. Thank you. There have also been massive declines in native bird species due to the introduction of non-native invasive species in native, such as domestic cats, rats, and many others, especially in Australia and Hawaii. He does say thanks again.
Yeah, great point to make. Great point. Cats, not just here in Australia, but there is no need to let your cat out at night. They're not lions and tigers. And it's certainly scientifically proven here in Australia that domestic cats being released at night have been the cause of an absolute decimation of our smallest mammals. And cats are useful for the farmers out in the big wheat areas where they have massive plagues of mice. Cats are useful, but you have to say that domestic animals are a real problem, and not just cats, by the way. A couple of years ago in the UK, a great natural history broadcaster, Chris Packham, released something called the People's Manifesto for Wildlife, and in it he suggested that all dogs should be kept on a lead all the time. Now this is in Britain, this is the nation of dog lovers. And so, these things can be quite quite difficult to deal with. It's always about compromises. But if we are going to make a difference, we all need to consider all of these areas. The domestic animals we own, the way that we farm, the way that we treat our gardens. But I do think it's probably worth saying in response to that, and also the other question about the rocket range. It's too easy to point the finger at someone else and say government should be sorting this, and or whoever, but actually it's me and you. That's where this stuff really starts. It's what we can do that makes a difference. Don't let your government off all its initiatives around the environment, but also, hold yourself responsible for what you do. Yeah.
Okay, so Matt Croxton has a quote here. What's hit is history, what's missed is mystery. A phrase uttered by early, I have trouble with this word, ornithologists to capture the difficulty of studying and identifying many species without the access provided by the full skin of a shot bird. This obviously greatly predates the advent of modern capture observation methods and conservation ethic. Excellent and accessible writing about this and so much more from early ornithology via Professor Tim Burkhead. The book is Birds and Us, The Wisdom of Birds. Thank you so much, Robin. What a treat it was. So you're familiar with that book?
That's a great book. It's a very good read, actually, for anyone that's interested. And yes, that answers my shock about birds being shot. It was a case of shoot it and collect the eggs, because at least you know something about the bird and you've got its history and everything preserved. But no, it's actually a great read, highly recommended. Perhaps you might just read that title out again, Jim, for people.
Certainly. So it's by Professor Tim Burkhead, and the title is Birds and Us, The Wisdom of Birds.
Yeah, highly recommended.
Mary Pat Kepler says, nice message. Afsal Ansari, I hope I got your name correct. Brilliant presentation, stunning images. David Teplica, Robin, your meticulous attention to standardization impressed me at that BPA symposium in 1988 and continues to inspire me here and now. Thank you. Scott Miles, wonderful presentation. And he has a question. Did you say there may be chemical residue on the surface of the specimen it's placed on? Could that stain a paper background?
Yeah, it's not liquid. These birds are dry. They've been gutted. It's just the skin of the bird. No, it's more about the genetic matter from the specimen coming off onto the background, and therefore I had to use liquid chemicals, special liquid chemicals that would guarantee the surface was clear and free. So that we didn't get any genetic transfer from specimen to specimen. But obviously the fact that you've got to use those liquids means that you couldn't use a paper background. That would be hopeless. That was why I used the plexiglass. And so I started with small chats and birds and bought bigger and bigger and bigger plexiglass as the birds got bigger. But yeah, so that was so it could be swabbed down, but it was really to avoid the genetic transfer, not any liquid that would come from the specimen. The liquid was the cleansing agent.
I have to say I had no idea that there was such thing as black plexiglass. That's new for me.
It's a good old trick from the 1970s from commercial photographers. It's how you get a perfect reflection of jewelry and those sorts of things on a jet black background. Ask Dan Patton, he used to use it all the time.
Excellent. Let's see. Sue Loomis, beautiful work, Robin. Koshi Johnson, stunning presentation. Hussein Mia Ibrahim, thank you, Robin, for your years of guidance. Mary Pat Kepler again, thank you, Robin. This was the most informative and interesting part of my day. Harold, Harold Carter.
That says a lot about the rest of her day, but anyway.
Harold Carter, thank you so much, Robin, for a great presentation. You never disappoint. Maya Diviak again, what a great way to start the day. Have to get into my work now. Thank you. And you had mentioned the Audubon Society. Mary Pat Kepler said that's a great idea. And that's the, oh, and Matt Croxton said thank you again. And throughout all the chat, numerous emojis of either applauding hands or a thumbs up. So excellent. So that takes care of that. Thank you all for your comments. Robin, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think most things have been covered. I would just like to reiterate something that really came up in response to those questions, and that is that it's not just climate change, it's a whole range of things that are affecting our loss of species, and we can all do something about it. This is not something that requires government intervention. And I recommend to you I mentioned it previously, the People's Manifesto for Wildlife, written, authored or edited by a British wildlife journalist called Chris Packham. And it contains over 200 recommendations of things that you can do in your life to make a difference to the future of the planet. And we're sort of coming up at the moment into the holiday season, and I have to say the best present that you could give your grandchild would actually be to make some small change in your life that makes the future of the planet better. It's important to them, and without it, their grandchildren might not have a future planet to live on. And I think with that thought, Jim, we might close off.
Thank you, Robin. That was well said.